Across the armies of the world, wealth is power. And in any contest of wealth, the nation of Saudi Arabia is practically a force of nature. As the proud owners of a sovereign wealth fund worth over $1 trillion, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the House of Saud rank among the richest and most influential political forces in the world. They command the Middle East's most lucrative oil-rich petrostate and direct their fire hose of pure financial capital toward everything from mega projects to science and technology to global business and entertainment. But unlike most nations with the power of Saudi Arabia, the nation's military isn't nearly as powerful as one might expect. In fact, it's little more than an afterthought, a chaotic collection of strangely structured forces, imported foreign hardware, and hardly any defense industrial complex to speak of. So, at a moment when the power balance of the Middle East is shifting rapidly and Saudi Arabia is looking to play an outsized role in global affairs, it's worth asking, why isn't Saudi Arabia the military powerhouse that it should be? What is Saudi Arabia doing to change the equation and build itself into a regional power that can meet the moment? And if Riyadh were to really commit itself, building both a more formidable military and a defense industrial complex, just how powerful could Saudi Arabia truly become? Of all the nations known for the extreme heights of their ambition, none are even remotely comparable to Saudi Arabia. To show just what we mean by that, here's a list of Saudi megaprojects that we've covered on our rather aptly named channel, Megaprojects. These include a over 100-kilometer long megacity in the open desert, a 400-meter tall cube that would become the world's single largest structure, a 2-kilometer tall skyscraper, a bridge that doubles as a hotel stretching across a massive lagoon, and an artificial moon, all initially promised to be ready by 2030, but probably not. Saudi Arabia is a nation attempting to overhaul its entire society by force, funneling hundreds of billions of dollars into highly speculative development projects, taking over entire global sports one after another, and building hyper-futuristic cities from the ground up with no clear evidence that anybody wants to actually live in those cities. But compare the grand scale of Saudi Arabia's broader ambitions to the state of its standing military, and the results are, shall we say, a little bit confusing. Saudi Arabia's armed forces are not tiny by any means. The nation boasts a total active duty troop count of 260,000, and in 2025 it's expected to spend nearly $80 billion on its military, over 7% of its GDP, and the 7th greatest net total of any nation on Earth. Its army boasts 500 American-made Abrams main battle tanks, several hundred self-propelled howitzers and multiple rocket launchers, and an anticipated total of nearly 100 lethal attack helicopters. Its navy will soon sail a total of 11 well-armed frigates, plus a healthy surface fleet of smaller combat vessels and several thousand Marines. The nation's Air Force flies over 300 copies of America's F-15E Strike Eagle, including nearly 100 that have been custom upgraded to a special Saudi standard, plus over 150 European-made fighters, and all the air-to-air refuelers, tactical airlifters, and airborne early warning aircraft that would be expected of a truly modern military. It has 10,000 troops focused solely on air defense, plus an entire branch of its military dedicated to strategic nuclear missiles, and is also known for its technological sophistication that allows it to keep pace with peer forces in Europe, Asia, and North America. But look a little closer at the Saudi military, and its standing relative to its international peers leaves something to be desired. In aggregate dollar amounts, Saudi Arabia spends roughly as much on its military as Germany, India, the UK, or France. But in one particular regard, each of those nations leaves the Saudi armed forces in the dust. Each of those nations, as well as other top military spenders like Japan, South Korea, and Israel, all have a robust military-industrial complex to call their own. The less impressive among them are still pretty impressive, while the best among their number are world leaders in military innovation. Each of them develops and builds a fair proportion of their own military hardware, like the French Rafale. The writer left me a pronunciation guide because I kept calling it the Raphael, like Rafael Nadal. I don't know why. I'm sorry, okay? Rafale, and the Caesar howitzer, or several classes of major combat vessels and multiple types of main battle tanks for Japan. Now, many of those nations export their military hardware. Each has next-generation indigenous designs currently under development, and all of them benefit from the immense technical knowledge that comes with building their own equipment. By contrast, the Saudi armed forces are almost entirely an imported military. All of its artillery, all of its tanks and heavy fighting vehicles, all of its manned aircraft, and its entire naval fleet were designed and built outside of the country. We mentioned that Saudi ranks 7th in the world in military expenditure, but it is the biggest military spender by far to be using practically zero indigenously designed or built hardware in its arsenal. In fact, it's not until we reach the Netherlands, number 19 on the list, and spending barely a quarter of what Saudi Arabia does, that we find a military that's anywhere near as reliant on foreign imports as the Saudis are. The foreign equipment it acquires often comes at an unusually high price, not because they buy expensive equipment that other countries can't afford, but because Saudi Arabia seems quite happy to pay for overpriced copies of the same equipment that other countries purchase for less. By all outward indicators, Riyadh isn't just content to pay extra prices for its advanced weapons, it's more than happy to live in a world where it has no better alternatives. Saudi Arabia barely has the beginnings of a defense industrial base, with just 2% of its overall military spending directed toward domestic suppliers as recently as the late 2010s. In terms of what Saudi Arabia actually does with that hardware, the results can be pretty confusing. First and foremost, its military is split in half for no clear reason at all. While the total force comprises about 260,000 troops, over half belong to the Saudi Arabian National Guard, which operates under a completely different chain of command through the nation's Ministry of National Guard, rather than being run by the Ministry of Defense like the rest of the armed forces. The National Guard's primary function is to protect the House of Saud from a coup d'etat, something it seems entirely capable of doing, given that it's larger than the rest of the military combined. The military's hardware choices also don't make much sense. Saudi Arabia often employs several redundant pieces of equipment from different nations to fill the same function when just one would suffice, and the proportions of certain types of equipment can be just downright strange. The army has more tanks and less artillery than would be expected for a force of this size. Its combat air fleet contains dozens of aircraft that are functionally redundant, and many of its special operators are cordoned off into even more ministries. And according to most international military personnel who've trained with Saudi troops, many among their number are either undermotivated, unfocused, or simply incompetent. Saudi Arabia's vast military expenditures provide nowhere near the return on investment that other Middle Eastern nations achieve, despite the fact that those other nations accomplish much more while spending significantly less. As we stated before, Saudi Arabia fields a standing military of 260,000 active duty troops, counting the National Guard. But compare Riyadh to a nation like Turkey, which maintains nearly 500,000 active duty personnel at its disposal, plus nearly 400,000 reservists. Turkey's military spending is less than a third of Saudi Arabia's. Or consider Iran, which maintains the largest standing military in the Middle East with over 600,000 active duty troops and 350,000 in reserve. Iran spends a tenth of what the Saudis do on defense, and they commit a much smaller proportion of their GDP. Egypt presents similar numbers, fielding about 440,000 active duty troops and 480,000 in reserve, despite spending the equivalent of under $5 billion on their armed forces, compared to almost $80 billion for the Saudis. In return for this massive expenditure, Saudi Arabia's active duty forces are more comparable by the numbers to nations with either a far smaller population, like Israel, or far lesser wealth, like Iraq. All told, Saudi Arabia's armed forces aren't just lacking in power or industrial independence relative to the nations that spend comparable sums on defense. They're lacking even when compared to their regional peers, despite having the sheer capital to eclipse many of them at once. Quite frankly, the military is in a state of atrophy that would horrify the leaders of most major militaries, and it comes with such complete dependence on foreign suppliers that those other nations could practically shut down the Saudi military if they felt Riyadh was stepping out of line. By any fair metric, Saudi Arabia's military is dismal relative to what it could and should be, so it's time that we figure out why. In the vast world of international defense spending, nothing happens by accident, and the current state of Saudi Arabia's military, that's no different. The nation's undersized armed forces, its peculiar and entirely imported composition, and its atrophied military-industrial complex are the product of deliberate choice, not coincidence. Understanding the thinking behind Riyadh's decision, well, that's critical if we're going to grasp the state of their military today. But in the special case of Saudi Arabia, the situation isn't necessarily the byproduct of poor decision-making. In many ways, the status of the Saudi military is entirely by design. Now, to explain what we mean, we'll start with the domestic side of things for Riyadh before going international. Now, at home, Saudi Arabia, sort of like an animal with no nearby predators. Very few nearby nations have the combined military and economic strength to challenge it. Those that could challenge it would rather not do so, and any nation that might be powerful and unhinged enough to try, hello Iran, is fighting on multiple fronts in the region. Iran also knows full well that an attack that got in the way of Saudi oil production would provoke an incredible global response. For that matter, Saudi Arabia knows that the international community will help protect its oil against any threat, meaning that the worst it has to worry about militarily are non-state actors like the Islamic State and the Houthi rebels. Cut the size of the Saudi military in half and then cut it in half again, and it would still be more than enough to respond to terror threats on its own soil, even if it wouldn't be able to consider intervening proactively in places like Yemen. But the threat that Saudi Arabia does face is the threat of regime change from within. Even the nation's name, Saudi Arabia, literally translates to the land of the House of Saud, directly referencing the sprawling royal family that has controlled the nation since it was unified in 1932. The House of Saud is, of course, very powerful within Saudi Arabia, but its leaders are well aware that they are not invincible. It's for that reason that Riyadh has chosen to split its military in two, sending the larger half into its own ministry as a national guard, then specifically charging that national guard with defending the regime from the smaller but considerably better equipped proper military. Not only that, but the regime benefits directly from a military that struggles to get its together, one where high-ranking officers with massive egos are busier competing for clout than plotting an overthrow of the crown prince. It benefits from a military rife with corruption and nepotism, where everyone's loyalty is available for purchase, where the people with the most power are often the ones with the least common sense, and where enlisted troops are openly encouraged not to think for themselves, lest they start getting their own ideas about how things should be. Beyond the regime's desire to neuter its own military and protect its stability, there are other reasons Saudi Arabia doesn't particularly care to build strong armed forces. For one thing, this is not a country where young Saudi men are typically willing to put their lives on hold and sign up to serve their country. Instead, it has been accused of relying on mercenaries from Yemen, Africa, and Latin America during its intervention in Yemen, while its reluctance to allow foreigners into its proper military inherently constrains its armed forces to remain as small as the recruiting pool dictates. Although Saudi Arabia could recruit more troops, it prefers to leave many capable young fighters to serve in the militias of their own clans and tribes with whom the Saudi state has cultivated a mutually beneficial arrangement. These fighters serve with the National Guard and enjoy all the financial incentives that come with it. This way, the regime can unify tribes that are loyal to the House of Saud, keep them loyal with a consistent flow of funds, and ensure that any tribes looking to go rogue become embroiled in clan rivalries long before they grow strong enough to challenge the royal family. International factors also play a crucial role, particularly when examining why Riyadh purchases so much foreign equipment and remains willing to accept hardware that's overpriced, redundant, or both. Regarding price, the answer's relatively straightforward. Saudi Arabia just has ridiculous amounts of money to spend. Other nations enjoy getting reliably paid, and by paying somewhat more than necessary for its hardware, Riyadh can build genuine goodwill with foreign capitals while dismissing its extra expenditures as little more than a rounding error. As for the nation's willingness to pay for redundant equipment, the reasoning follows a similar pattern. Riyadh can build goodwill by purchasing more from foreign suppliers. But there's also another angle to consider. Like so many other elements of Saudi Arabia's grand ambition, the nation's military leaders tend to operate by the rule of cool. If the Saudi military has most of its critical boxes checked off and can afford to spend a little more in order to look badass, then, well, damn it, they're going to look badass. There's also another more pragmatic reason for Saudi Arabia to rely on so much foreign military equipment and to source it from numerous different world powers simultaneously. The value here lies in the reality of foreign military exports. Specifically, when you purchase a complex piece of advanced hardware from another nation, you're also purchasing decades of spare parts shipments, software updates, and ongoing support. Therefore, for however long you're fielding that foreign military kit, you'd better ensure that you don't antagonize the nations that are supplying it. For most countries that rely on foreign hardware, export limitations are a persistent headache that makes them vulnerable to the meddling and coercion of major powers, a burden they must simply tolerate as the price of doing business. Just ask Riyadh's rivals in Tehran, who have struggled to keep all sorts of hardware operational under the crushing weight of Western sanctions. For Saudi Arabia, however, there's another way of looking at the situation. As we've mentioned, the rest of the world is very interested in ensuring that the nation's oil keeps flowing directly from the desert sands and into the global market. For Riyadh to remain reliant on that foreign hardware to protect that oil should give other nations peace of mind in two ways at once. First, it guarantees that Saudi resources are protected by equipment that powerful nations know very well and believe they can trust, rather than taking the risk that untested indigenous Saudi equipment would fail at the moment of truth. Second, it allows Riyadh to quite painlessly hand away leverage over its armed forces, giving the US, China, Europe, Russia, and other suppliers the knowledge that they could threaten export controls if needed. That's good reassurance for Riyadh's foreign partners, but it doesn't sacrifice much for Saudi Arabia, given that its leaders weren't inclined to build a more independent military anyway. Now, although Saudi Arabia may have its reasons to avoid building a bigger military than it currently has, and although it may have its reasons for allowing itself to rely on foreign imports, that still doesn't fully explain the disconnect between the nation's military potential and its military reality. There's still the question of just why Riyadh has chosen not to build a military-industrial complex, if not for its own use, then for export abroad, at a moment when the nation seems to be working its way into every money-making venture that it possibly can. Over the last decade and more, Saudi Arabia has embarked on a nationwide effort to transform itself in preparation for a new world that it's actively helping to create. Riyadh is well aware that the vast majority of its fortunes have, across modern history, come by way of the oil trade. But while oil wealth is clearly a very nice thing to have, it comes with a couple of key problems. First, the oil is going to run out someday. Second, the demand for oil might not even last as long as the oil does. As the world moves toward renewable energy sources and Riyadh accepts that it won't be able to fight that change forever, it faces the prospect of bringing an oil economy into a largely post-oil world, which is what both we and the Saudis would call a losing proposition. For Riyadh, the answer to that problem is diversification, taking as much of its saved-up oil wealth as possible and using it to kickstart as many other self-sustaining industries as possible before either the oil runs out or the money does. Since 2016, the Saudis have organized the bulk of those efforts under Vision 2030, a massive government program that's intended to surge as much funding as possible and accelerate development to a frankly ridiculous degree. It's this effort to diversify its economy that has led Saudi Arabia to invest in so many wildly aspirational projects all at once. The nation is trying to make itself into a major global tourist destination and a waypoint for both world travelers and freight logistics. It's working to become the dominant force in sports and entertainment, a major player in the global real estate market, and a center for entrepreneurial innovation. The kingdom is targeting well-educated foreigners to participate in vast projects leveraging AI and other advanced technologies, while simultaneously trying to transform itself into a viable competitor in the renewable energy sector that will ultimately diminish the demand for Saudi oil. And yes, it's also become a world leader in producing absolutely wild concept art, sometimes because those concepts are meant to culminate in real-life versions of what's being proposed, but always because they serve as an effective way of drawing attention, debate, and public interest toward the larger societal transformation that Saudi Arabia is working to accomplish. Vision 2030 does touch on questions of defense, setting an initial goal to localize over half of Saudi Arabia's military spending within the nation by 2030 at the latest. However, in practice, that goal just hasn't translated into building a healthy defense industrial complex. Instead, the initiative has mostly resulted in numerous relocation efforts, moving production lines of foreign equipment onto Saudi soil so that manufacturing can be done domestically, while design, development, testing, and advanced research have been largely ignored. In 2017, the nation announced that it would establish a state-owned military corporation, Saudi Arabian Military Industries. But its responsibilities remain starkly limited. The company, colloquially known as SAMI, was charged primarily with building and maintaining hardware, and for the most part, that's precisely what has happened. The kingdom's other state-owned military groups mostly produce basic equipment and ammunition, with limited development efforts focusing on digital and electronic security. Beyond that, programs to develop complex military equipment simply do not exist. And to be clear, it doesn't appear that Saudi leaders were hoping to achieve anything more ambitious than that. At least in the early years of Vision 2030, high-level Saudi officials and spokespeople routinely confirmed that their aspirations were modest at best. They hoped their national defense industry would form deeper collaborative relationships with foreign nations, import technologies that could be manufactured locally, and then begin exporting after a decade or two. When asked directly about potential opportunities for Saudi industry to export to countries that struggle with Western export controls, the leader of Saudi Arabia's General Authority for Military Industries made clear in a 2019 interview that the country hadn't yet made plans to capitalize on such opportunities. Similarly, when other leaders were asked about reducing Saudi Arabia's dependence on foreign arms providers, they routinely offered the same basic reply. Their focus was on diversifying their acquisitions from multiple international providers rather than becoming a producer of indigenously designed technologies. As for why Saudi leaders were so hesitant to beef up a defense export industry, that's kind of hard to say. The nation's leaders haven't addressed the question directly, and until the last few years, they haven't seemed to agree that it was even a problem. Perhaps a focus on defense industrial initiatives would have been too sharp of a contrast with the glitzy, futuristic appeal of other Vision 2030 projects, or would have risked shining a light on all the geopolitics of it all, at a moment when Saudi Arabia's pitch to the world was one of benevolent, visionary ambition. Or perhaps it was a strategic oversight, a misreading of the value of the global arms market. Perhaps Saudi leaders avoided the topic out of fears that it would drive Western nations to expand the scope of export controls over their own military technology, a fair portion of which was being denied to Riyadh at the time. But no matter what motivated Saudi Arabia's thinking at the time, it is safe to say, in hindsight, that simply ignoring the economic potential of defense was a major missed opportunity. Over the last decade, several nations have grown into major players in the highly lucrative arms export industry. South Korea, Turkey, and China, along with Germany and France, which have had very strong performances in recent years. In each case, the indigenously developed equipment of those nations has become their major selling point. Fighter jets from France, tanks from Germany, combat drones from Turkey, and so on. In each case, the growing defense industrial role of these nations has coincided with rising power and influence on the global stage. While each of them had a much more robust defense industry than Saudi Arabia possessed a decade ago, none of them invested anywhere near as much money toward defense as Saudi Arabia has invested across its Vision 2030 projects. At the same time, the Saudis have demonstrated a willingness to pursue many of the same strategies that might have helped bridge this gap. They've invested heavily in recruiting foreign experts, building new production lines and physical infrastructure, and expanding research institutions, just not in ways that directly apply to military-industrial matters. Instead, Saudi Arabia has discovered the hard way that, despite its broader efforts to become more relevant on the global stage, there's simply no easy path to relevance in the defense world without being able to design and build the hardware yourself. Other relevant nations can design advanced military hardware across multiple domains simultaneously. They can test and refine their equipment efficiently and then scale into production as needed using their own facilities and their own expertise. Not every initiative proceeds successfully, but the process itself has been refined to achieve consistent excellence. By comparison, Saudi Arabia today isn't just a step behind, it's barely even a participant in high-level defense conversations. As a 2018 report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies noted, far too many major Saudi security decisions and investments over a period of decades have not been part of any coherent force improvement plan. Saudi security investments have been made with limited regard to cost effectiveness. One particularly embarrassing example illustrates this gap. Just a few months ago, at the time of writing, Saudi Arabia requested to join the Global Combat Air Programme. It's a joint effort between the UK, Italy, and Japan to develop a sixth-generation fighter jet. The response Saudi Arabia received from the GCAP nations bordered on condescension. As the programme's leaders diplomatically pointed out, Saudi Arabia doesn't have an aerospace industry and would hardly be a valuable partner. Perhaps the head of Italian aerospace corporation Leonardo suggested this February the Saudis could start by assembling a few Eurofighter jets on an assembly line, and then they could discuss next steps. Over the last several years, Saudi leaders have watched alongside the rest of the world as the international order has begun to change dramatically. When Riyadh first laid out Vision 2030, there was no way to predict that within a decade, Russia and Ukraine would engage in a years-long war, Israel and Iran would alter the balance of power in the Middle East through head-to-head conflict, and China would rise to stand opposite America as a true global superpower. Like every other nation, Saudi Arabia has watched as its expectations for the future have, at times, failed to match reality. And like every other nation, Saudi Arabia has had to determine how to respond. In the past couple of years, this has meant Riyadh rethinking its military expenditures and its decision to sideline its defense industry. During that time, Saudi Arabia has made solid progress in increasing its capacity for military production on its own soil. The kingdom has now localized about 20% of its production needs as of 2024, while expanding the number of military industrial facilities in the country from just 5 in 2019 to over 300 at the start of this year. While the kingdom isn't really quite on track to reach its Vision 2030 goals, which would require localizing a full 50% of its defense production, it does seem like it will get relatively close and should be able to hit that benchmark before the 2030s are out. Senior Saudi leaders have suggested that the nation is even about to turn a corner in its defense industrial growth, hitting a level of progress that will allow its capacity to start growing exponentially rather than just by a couple of percentage points every year. As time has progressed, Saudi Arabia has increasingly played a more active role in jointly developing military equipment alongside other nations. The kingdom has worked with China to build infrastructure for producing ballistic missiles, developed a combat management system designed jointly with Spain, opened its doors to receive indigenous defense technology from Turkey, and recently established a bilateral development relationship with South Korea to facilitate collaborative research and design. Its acquisition patterns have shifted significantly as well. China now supplies 4 times the amount of equipment that it once provided. South Korea has begun sending air defense systems, and Germany has reopened its relationship with Saudi Arabia by supplying air-to-air missiles, this after several years during which Berlin had banned military exports to Riyadh. This evolution means that Saudi Arabia has gained greater access to sophisticated equipment for study and analysis, along with increased access to knowledge and technical capabilities of various partner nations. Notably, the kingdom has accomplished all of this without sacrificing its defense relationship with America. This past May, Washington agreed to sell Saudi Arabia nearly $150 billion worth of weapons, setting the stage for a potential future sale of the F-35 stealth fighter jet. With these new developments, Saudi Arabia has demonstrated its ability to acquire more advanced and more formidable equipment, strengthening its standing military at a crucial time for the region. Currently, the nation confronts an evolving security landscape as the broader Middle East has been thrown into turmoil. Yemen's Houthi rebels, positioned to Saudi Arabia's south, represent a growing threat, as do Islamic State operatives who appear to be preparing for a resurgence in Syria and Iraq. The Saudis recently benefited from a fortunate turn during the brief conflict between Iran and Israel, with Iran opting not to attempt a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. However, Riyadh understands as well as anyone that that conflict could return to Iran, and should Iran attempt to cut off the strait, the Saudi military might be compelled to intervene. With superior equipment, Saudi Arabia should be able to feel confident that it can deter most potential adversaries and effectively handle those it cannot simply intimidate. But even with all of these changes, Riyadh still hasn't built the complete top-to-bottom defense industrial complex that it's capable of creating. The nation's push toward domestic weapons manufacturing hasn't translated into new initiatives to design or build their own equipment, even though the country is positioned to start looking for new opportunities. Many of Saudi Arabia's most ambitious megaprojects have been downgraded or just quietly swept out of sight, while negative press has only accumulated, from human rights concerns to hesitation from foreign investors to red flags in the country's economic numbers to new reports that over 21,000 workers may have died while working on Vision 2030 projects from 2017 until 2024. That's 21,000. Some Vision 2030 projects are performing reasonably well, specifically the projects that channel Saudi wealth into initiatives that are more self-sustaining and work to meet actual demand that, exists, as opposed to what Riyadh claimed was the demand for a glittering linear city in the middle of the desert. Initiatives that can attract well-trained subject matter experts both from Saudi Arabia and from around the world, and then channel their expertise into well-funded and concrete projects, while these do tend to deliver results. And at a moment when Saudi Arabia is witnessing the shifts in the global oil market that it was concerned about, this is precisely when the push to diversify the Saudi economy needs to start delivering. For the nation to overcome its long-standing reticence and throw its resources into building a real arms industry, that would be a solution that leverages the nation's clearly demonstrated strengths while clearly avoiding many of the same pitfalls it has been unable to navigate in the past. A Riyadh that isn't content to simply slap a Made in Saudi Arabia sticker on somebody else's military hardware is a Riyadh that could join an ongoing spending boom in the defense world. It has more money to solicit the help of more experts and to invest in better design and development infrastructure than almost any other global competitor. It can follow the model that other nations in similar positions have laid out while achieving comparable levels of success far faster than the competition, both because it can benefit from the lessons they learned through trial and error and because it can funnel more resources to defense firms than any of the others. For Saudi Arabia to go all in on defense, it should be a winning proposition. And for that reason, it's all the more perplexing that the nation still hasn't taken the leap. Now, our objective in presenting this episode isn't try and submit an application to be Riyadh's newest defense consultants. Instead, it's to study a genuinely fascinating case in Saudi Arabia, a nation with not just the wealth, but the ambition that would suggest it should at the very least be a regional military authority. Yet it shows a nearly absolute lack of will to make that happen. Look, we're not going to spend much time considering whether Saudi Arabia will reverse course anytime soon. After all, if that was something the nation's leaders were interested in doing, they would have taken one of their innumerable opportunities to switch things up. That hasn't happened. It doesn't appear likely to happen, and until or unless something changes, we can reasonably assume that it isn't going to happen. But we can take a moment to ask a different question and conclude this episode with a bit of educated speculation. If Saudi Arabia did decide to change course, either to strengthen its own military or to build out an exporting defense industry, then what could it achieve? Well, we'll start with Saudi Arabia's own military, where a few key guiding features aren't likely to change. The House of Saud will continue to prioritize its own survival, cultivate a situation in which nobody can gather the strength required for regime change, and keep relying on foreign military hardware, even if a growing portion is going to be built in-house. Given these constraints, it's unlikely that Saudi Arabia would ever grow its standing army of less than 80,000 to the size of Turkey or Iran's forces. It's even less likely to convince a wave of affluent, comfortable young Saudi men to sign on the dotted line. But the nation could build out its capabilities in different directions, starting with the question of foreign manpower. As we've mentioned earlier, Saudi Arabia has a shadowy history of relying on mercenaries. Since it doesn't allow foreigners to join the military proper, mercenary forces could offer a valuable way for the nation to develop greater offensive capabilities, specialize in certain overlooked areas, and assert itself abroad. Right now, in the mid-2020s, we live in a moment where the demand for global mercenary forces is on the rise. It was Russia's Wagner group that really built the model, using nameless, faceless, and seemingly nationless soldiers to establish control over reserves of critical minerals and other resources. But nations from Turkey to China to the Emirates have started to build similar organizations, dispatching them across the globe to establish a presence in highly profitable zones where their weaponry, training, and coordination put them head and shoulders above most local threats on the ground. Saudi Arabia is a prime candidate to get in on that game. Its financial resources can be devoted to quite literal purchases of loyalty from armed actors, and its reliance on foreigners to do the job extends the veil of plausible deniability even further. Not only that, but if Saudi Arabia were to replicate the resource-extracting operations of other nations in mercenary-controlled areas, operations could quickly pay for themselves while helping to diversify the Saudi economy even further. Now look, to be clear, this is not an argument that this international mercenary dynamic is a positive force in the world. Instead, our objective is just to understand the ways that Saudi resources can be used to further Saudi interests. When it comes to military procurement for export, Saudi Arabia could conceivably scale up its current approach by building the military hardware of other nations rather than designing and developing its own models. Across the globe, and especially in Europe, there are plenty of hardware-producing nations that possess cutting-edge designs but lack the production capacity to meet demand within a reasonable timeline. By expanding its military sector to support not just its own military needs, but also the import requirements of other nations, Saudi Arabia could enhance the ability of arms-producing nations to actually manufacture the hardware that they design. Moreover, production facilities on Saudi soil would help the nation preserve one of the most important geopolitical advantages that accompanies its oil wealth, one that we've referenced throughout this episode. Nobody wants to see Saudi Arabia attacked, simply because that would place the nation's oil reserves at risk. While reduced global demand for oil could alter that dynamic, it could very quickly be restored if powerful world nations come to rely on Saudi Arabia to build their military equipment, whether for domestic use or export abroad. And finally, there's all the things that Saudi Arabia could achieve if it did decide to try designing its own indigenous military hardware. There are some areas where Riyadh is unlikely to become competitive within the next decade or two, specifically many of the traditional areas we'd usually think of when we imagine defense exports. Saudi Arabia is going to need a very long time to teach itself to build tanks, fighter jets, or naval destroyers on par with nations that have been building those weapons for generations. But Riyadh's existing investments, largely through Vision 2030, offer the potential to take a different path forward. The nation is trying to turn itself into a hub for high-tech manufacturing, similar to Taiwan, South Korea, or Switzerland. When it comes to military technology, there are some real opportunities for Saudi Arabia to get in on the ground floor. Those would include the development of advanced artificial intelligence tools, robotics technology, cybersecurity, encryption and secure communication, 3D printed manufacturing, and more. All areas that Saudi Arabia is already prioritizing with its investments and where it hopes to become a world leader. Bridge its civilian investments into the defense world, and Riyadh could see massive returns. In fact, it's this last possibility that currently seems the most likely, with early indicators that Riyadh really could consider a larger pivot into niche high-tech defense projects over the next few years. So, well, that's the kind of lengthy story on the Saudi military, a strange amalgamation of international hardware intentionally hamstrung by the very regime that seeks to use it, serving as one small part of a complex geopolitical game that Saudi Arabia is trying to win. Riyadh is not the defense leader that one might expect, but that's not an accident, it's a choice, and one that the House of Saud believes will serve its needs better than any fighter jet or main battle tank ever could. Thank you for watching.